moral rationalization of slavery in the view of slaves as the essential proof of white men's royal status became as fundamental to whites' perception of America as the concept of liberty itself. And I see that, and I think you elaborate on this further in the book. This was really the beginning of the whole concept of white supremacy.
That's exactly right.
And talk about that and how that was used, again, as a labor tool to convince poor whites that no matter how desperate or dire their economic straits were, they were still better than black people.
Wow. Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's great that you zeroed in on that one passage. It's one of my favorite things in the book. I wrote it so long ago that I don't know that I can still explain it. But but the basic idea there is that because there is this sort of this issue of and some of this gets into philosophy and the Enlightenment, but you have this new place, and it was an exciting and remarkable endeavor. There were these, for the most part, people without a lot of means, many of them convicts and prisoners, who were ending up in this wilderness and trying to carve out of it a new country and a new place. That's a cool thing. There's no doubt about it. That's cool and heroic, particularly the idea of it and the beginnings of it. And a big thing driving all of those colonists was their offense. Fundamentally, their offense at the idea that as they began to be able to create a place on their own, they were offended by the European tradition and the religious tradition even, but offended by this idea that the king or the royalty somehow, this notion that those folks are somehow better than us regular folks, and we're out here creating this whole new country that's enriching all of them. Doesn't it sound familiar? But they get to be treated as if they're somehow special and that we're not. And so when we read the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and the words of the Founding Fathers today, we tend to read it with ears of 2015, not ears of 1770. And our ears of 2015 tell us that when they said all men are created equal, what they really meant was that every creature that is male and walks on two legs is created equal. But that's not what they meant. And what they were really about, I argue, and I think it's true, they were about extending royalty to themselves. They weren't about saying that there shouldn't be anything royal. They were about that, well, all of us are just as royal as the royals. All of us Englishmen are just as special as the king. All of us Englishmen can talk to God. All of us Englishmen can have agency and can pursue happiness and can be equal to one another. It was about that we're all royal, not that none of us are royal, is what they were really saying. But at the same time, if you're going to say, well, all of us are royal, well, you still have to have somebody who's not.
There's got to be a subject.
There's got to be a subject. And so that became another element of rationalizing all of this, was that, well, here's this other population that looks different from us, and it's black people, and it's Native Americans, and at times you're going to argue that it's other people who we now would call white people. But for a long time, it's anybody from Southern Europe. For a long time, Italians were supposed to be less than white people. And Greeks were less than white people by many definitions. And so, but that basic idea that from the very beginning of American society, we bake into it this notion that the sense of liberty and equality among Englishmen or among white people, or however you want to call it, is predicated on the idea that there are these other people who are not equal and who are not free and who don't have the pursuit of happiness available to them, and that's part of what makes us special and royal. And that is, I would agree, is the beginnings of white supremacy, because white supremacy is a uniquely American idea. I mean, it really begins as an American concept. We're the first place where that language is actively used, and then the Germans and others begin to be influenced by us in many respects, and then take it to whole new other heights and begin to influence the worst of us.
My final question.
This is 4. You said you only had 3.
I know. I'm the moderator, so I know that.
All right. I'm just watching out for everybody else as best I can.
We're counting too.
Final question. The brutality And I think it's important to expound on the nature of it and why there was such brutality. And you write, the point of these beatings was manyfold. The most obvious was to create a specific disincentive to escape. Just as important was to show the power of whites, not just to cause pain, but to force a black man to bear profound humiliation. To be reduced to a state of pathetic powerlessness, to visibly see how quickly and effortlessly even the most simpleton whites could force a defiant black man to reveal emotional vulnerability and physical weakness. And I think that is relevant because it didn't end then. I think that has become an element of conditioning, and it manifests itself today. But talk about why that is so important.
Yeah, the level of violence in this period that I'm writing about, after slavery is supposed to be over, is really deeply disturbing. Anybody who's read all of the book will have registered that. There are parts of the book that are very difficult to read because of that. And that's a deliberate decision on my part to include all those things and to not varnish any of it and not to shy away from any of it. And what is remarkable about all those records that I was describing earlier that I eventually found was how much stuff was recorded. You know, that it wasn't just who got picked up and who got sold where and for how much and how long they lived and all that. There are a lot of records, just like there were whipping books kept on the old plantations and for antebellum slavery, and in this new kind of servitude that was created, in part because periodically some really bad thing would happen, the word would get out, usually because a white person might have gotten sucked into the system and get really badly brutalized, something would get out of hand and a white person would end up dead or just viciously beaten or tortured in one of these places, and word of that would get out and there would be outrage, and there were always some people who thought that all of this was getting out of hand and that black people were being mistreated. And in fact, some of the most important voices of what was happening are some of those letters I referred to, the 30,000 pages of them in the National Archives. A lot of those are white people writing into the Department of Justice saying, I can't believe what's happening in my county. You know, there's this farmer over here who's the most powerful man, and they just grab black people whenever they want them, and they can never escape, and they rape these women over and over again. Shouldn't something be done about this? You know, it is often the case white people who raise that alarm in many circumstances. But the level of violence that was being perpetrated led at times to efforts to reform the system, actually, reform. And so you would have, after some big outrage that would come out, you might have the state legislature of Florida or Alabama or Georgia, you know, the states over and over again would pass new laws regulating these things because they were embarrassed by something that had happened. And so there might be a requirement that would say, well, from this point on in those turpentine camps, you have to keep a record of every time you whip a man. And an inspector is going to come around once a month and once every 6 months and look at the records, and nobody should be whipped more than 100 times. That's the sort of thing it would actually say. And no one should be whipped, you know, if they've been whipped 4 days in a row, they shouldn't be whipped on the 5th day. Those are the kinds of rules that would be put in place. And so a lot of those records survive. And so I found a lot of that, and they are really, really, really horrifying.
And you also make the point that in many instances, the brutality in the convict leasing program was worse than slavery,
right? Because
the slaves were valuable, the convicts were replaceable and free.
Exactly.
So you could be more brutal to someone that you didn't have to pay for, as opposed to someone that was considered to be a piece of your property and your estate.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things in the movie 12 Years a Slave, which for the most part I thought was a very powerful and effective movie and a fairly accurate depiction of what slavery was like. But one of the things in it that I found completely preposterous was when our main character, whose name I'm drawing a blank on, but Solomon Northrop, at one point when he's sent on an errand and he's thinking about running away, and he's out in the woods, you know, on a pathway to another place, and he gets a little bit turned around, maybe even does run away, it's not quite clear, but he gets lost, and then comes back onto a path and turns a corner and comes upon a scene where there are, I think, 3 black men in the process of being lynched by white men who'd been sent out to chase down these escaped slaves. Well, there is almost no way that would ever happen. You know, you might beat them and humiliate them, but you would not kill unless these men had raped a white woman or been accused of killing a white person. You didn't murder a slave,
or were plotting a
conspiracy. Right. You would execute them, but you would not. If somebody ran away, you would pay somebody else money to go and get them and bring them back. You would never kill them, because enslaved people were so valuable. A slave owner almost always had more money invested in the enslaved people he controlled than in the land that he owned. The cost of, and of course it rose and fell all the time because there was a market, but enslaved people were highly valuable. That's also one reason why the business of slavery, and it was a business, the antebellum slavery was an industry. It was not a practice, it was an industry. In fact, it was the most valuable industry in America. And the second most valuable industry in America was cotton. And they worked hand in hand. And so this industry of slavery, in which I always point out, hundreds of thousands of people were employed in the industry of slavery who never owned a slave. So the next time somebody says, well, my family never owned any slaves, it's like, well, A, you don't know, and B, it doesn't matter. But the business of slavery involved 2 things: the work done by the enslaved people and the production of more enslaved people. And so that is why a slave owner, as brutal as slavery was, wanted there to be men and women around, wanted children to be born, because they were valuable and you could raise them up and they added to your wealth. And so you wanted procreation and you wanted the work of enslaved people. Those were the 2 elements of value in that economic system. Well, after the Civil War, in this new system that is in many respects much more harsh than the system beforehand,